Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Jenny Clegg and I'm a Vice President of the Society for Anglo-Chinese Understanding. And today I'm going to be in conversation with Professor Kerry Brown about his book that came out earlier this year on Xi Jinping. It's called Xi, A Study in Power. And now Kerry is a professor of Chinese studies and director at the Lau China Institute at King's College London. From 2012 to 2015, he was professor of Chinese politics at the University of Sydney in Australia. He's an associate of the Asia Pacific program at Chatham House, having worked there for a number of years, and he is a former diplomat, serving as first secretary at the British Embassy in Beijing from 1998 to 2005. So a great deal of experience there. And not only that, he's the author of almost at least 20 books on modern Chinese politics. And he has to be the most prolific person that I've ever come across. His articles on China are as likely to be found in The Spectator as in Beijing Review. And he's made his mark also, I think, as a great public communicator on Chinese affairs and has been a good friend of SACU. So Kerry's book, which I have here, is on a very significant topic. I must say it's very accessible and readable. I enjoyed it, Kerry. And of course, very timely with Xi Jinping now starting his third term of office following the 20th Communist Party Congress, which finished last week. We will be discussing Kerry's book, Xi and Xi's career and his political development and leadership. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end to have an exchange of views on the 20th Party Congress. So first of all, Kerry, just tell us about your book and what motivated you to write it. What were the key themes that you wanted to bring out? How was it received, if I can ask that question?
Great. Well, thanks, Jenny. And thanks to colleagues at SACU, including Zoe and other people who've arranged this. People are coming today on a Saturday afternoon, so it is greatly appreciated. So I had written previously about Xi Jinping in a book called The New Emperors, and then the CEO of China, The Rise of Xi Jinping, but now he's very much risen. And so I thought, okay, I may as well sort of do an assessment of the almost decade that he's been in power. And there's obviously a lot of information. He's spoken a lot. He's had 3 books of his speeches and various writings published in the governance of China. And there's been an enormous amount of kind of focus on him. But in terms of an accessible book that just explains what he is as a politician, I mean, I don't think there has been much. There is an endless amount about Xi Jinping, the autocrat, and, you know, all this kind of stuff about, you know, how scary his leadership is. But I kind of thought, well, he's obviously successful in the Chinese system. And how did that work? You know, how did he actually kind of get in this very unique position? And so I just sort of wanted to look a bit at his background. There's obviously some material, as you see in the book, from his very early years when he was, you know, sent down in the Cultural Revolution to the countryside. So that's 7 years of his life. That's really important to understand. There's also things that he wrote or had written for him when he was a younger provincial official, particularly in Zhejiang, where he was the party boss from 2002 to 2007. And I looked at those and kind of was interested by how there were sort of parallels between the themes he announced then on environmentalism, need for party discipline and that kind of stuff, and today. I mean, writing about Xi Jinping is a precarious business, as you no doubt know, Jenny. I mean, because I think there's an expectation that there's a narrative which is acceptable about him, and that is that, you know, he is the autocrat, he's a dictator, he's in a dictatorial system. And, you know, writing a book about that, I'm sure there'll be plenty of people that would applaud that book. But I made clear in this book that, you know, I just want to understand his politics and not make judgments. I mean, there are things which obviously have worked in his leadership period, and there are things that haven't worked. And I just wanted to sort of be an observer and try and sort of look on. And I think, to my surprise, actually, most reviewers have been pretty sympathetic, and they've kind of understood that. I guess the complaint for some reviewers, I mean, I think my friend Gideon Rachman in the Financial Times, he wrote a kind review, but he did say there needed to be more on human rights and these sorts of issues. And then another reviewer kind of felt that there needs to be more on the economy. But it's a short, accessible book. And so I had a very good editor who was very harsh with me. I produced lots of material actually on those things. And they basically said, no, we would prefer that you just keep it to the more accessible, simpler stuff and tell a story. And so I hope that's what the book has done.
Indeed, yes. You say that Xi should not be dismissed as a dictator, and that an understanding of his leadership is crucial to the future of the world. And I think that this is something that, we really have to think about all the more so now in the light of the 20th Party Congress. And your book really explores the relationship between Xi and the Chinese Communist Party. And you explore the kind of development of his vision, what we might call Xi Jinping thought. And you say, that Xi's power is the power of the party. The two cannot be understood apart from each other. You say Xi is the lead actor, the party is the star attraction. And so how would you look at his political development through the various stages of his career? You've just mentioned, obviously, he was the son of a revolutionary hero who became a vice premier, but that is not really very much of the story. You look at the other things, for example, you mentioned his 7 years in the rural areas, and then you mention his experience in Zhejiang. And from that kind of background, what were the kind of things you would pick out in terms of his values, if you like, his political values?
Yeah, I mean, values is an important word. I mean, you referred a bit earlier, Jenny, to there are many people in the Chinese political elite. I mean, it's not a small. I mean, it's a small group in some ways, but it's not just him. There are many other families, networks like the Bo family, Bo Xilai, his father Bo Yibo. And so, one of the kind of mysteries, I suppose, is why did he get this sort of position? If you think in the late 1990s, to be a member of one of these red elite families was not a good thing. I mean, Hu Jintao wasn't from this background, I mean, when he was president. So it was a bit of a burden. And famously, Xi Jinping at the 1997 Congress was, sort of not voted onto the Central Committee. I mean, I think he became an alternate member because he got the lowest number of votes. So it wasn't a great thing to have an elitist background. And now that seems to have not been a problem for him at all. So I think we have to kind of recognize that there is something about him. It's not his elite background that accounts for him being where he is. There's something else. I think there's two things which are striking about his previous declarations, even when he was not, remotely in line for power or promotion at an upper level. And that is a kind of cast iron faith in the Communist Party of China. I use the word faith very, very deliberately. I mean, I say he's a man of faith. I mean, he believes in the mission of this party. Now, I am not saying anyone else has to believe in the mission of this party, or that I know what it means to say, the mission of the Communist Party is something. But Xi Jinping has this sense of, believing in this mission. And I mean, I think it's really striking. He talked about the party in a very kind of distinctive way in the 1990s in Fujian and then in the 2000s in Zhejiang as something that was almost, had a moral obligation to rule and to rule well, and therefore couldn't be involved in corruption and business and, these kinds of things. And if you remember at that time in China, of course, most officials were absolutely involved in business and, feeding their networks vast amounts of money. So I think his one insight, probably, which marks him out, was the understanding that at the time when the Communist Party of China was presiding over the greatest growth economically that a country had ever been through, in the Hu Jintao era, it quadrupled the size of its economy from 2002 to 2012. That wasn't the main business of the party. The main business of the party was politics. And I think that's really a huge kind of differentiator between him and most of the other people around him. And I think the second thing is that he's a born-again communist. And I mean by that, people are puzzled as to why he is such a faithful servant of the party in view of the fact that his father, Xi Jinping, was in effect under house arrest for nearly 2 decades. And he went through a great deal of hardship in the Cultural Revolution, and indeed wrote about the Cultural Revolution in the late 1990s, Xi Jinping, in a very critical way. He very rarely refers to it now, but he said something about, I went through much hardship then and felt that I could face anything because of how I suffered then. And I think people assume, okay, this would have made him resentful and angry against the party. But it's often the case that the most zealous and, kind of fervent supporters are those who have been tested or, kind of rejected, harmed, and survived. And Xi Jinping's family was spared. They were not, persecuted to the level where they were actually destroyed in the Maoist period. They were spared. They lived on and they prospered. And I think this has given him a kind of, this sort of, he's the survivor because of the mercy of the party. The party the party giveth and the party taketh. And I think that's really a kind of almost like a spiritual relationship. And finally, we have to remember, he applied to join the party 10 times in 1974. I mean, he really wanted to join at a time when, he was still a sent down youth. He got in on the 10th go, probably because the official that had been blocking him had moved on, and then he was allowed in by another official. But this shows a real kind of desire to be part of this organization. He is, I think, a true believer. And in a country where probably belief is not widespread, to be a believer is a remarkably powerful thing. So I think he believes, even if no one else does. And that's why he's where he is.
So he's kind of got this image of, a cadre as, the ideal cadre as, plain living and hard work, and sort of from that rural background. And then, as you've mentioned before, in the Zhejiang years, he's driving through this separation between business and politics, seeing, the kind of corruption that's going on around him. And of course, corruption has been a very, very serious problem. But we can't say that China was totally consumed by it. But and he's also saying things, that you bring out in the book, that GDP is not everything. We've got to look at the quality of growth. And as you say, it's very much a book about the party. And as I was reading it, I was reminded of how, Mao's counterpart, as it were, Liu Shaoqi, wrote a book on how to be a good communist. And then that was criticized in the Cultural Revolution because it was Confucian and, it's all about self-cultivation. But I don't think that Xi Jinping's emphasis on morality is quite the same as that.
Yeah, I mean, How to Be a Good Communist, I think that came out in 1939, I believe. And I think one of the things about Liu Shaoqi's sort of admonishments to party members is to be self-denying. And it almost extinguished their sort of personalities or their personal kind of habits to be loyal to the party. So I think that loyalty is definitely a continuity with the Liu Shaoqi message, even though, as you say, in the Maoist period, that was, criticized. Look, I mean, I think the success of the Xi Jinping project, and by success, again, I just mean the fact that he has maintained 10 years in power and looks to be continuing that, and seen off all potential opponents. So the success of that, I think, is partly because of an understanding that the Communist Party of China is a nationalist party in many ways. And it's guided by a vision of, a powerful, great, strong China, which transcends everything else. I mean, it's a transcendent message in as much as it was something, that was there at the end of the Qing dynasty. It was something the nationalists tried to kind of have ownership over. And the communists are now the custodians of this, because they're the custodians of the physical territory of China, the People's Republic of China, as it is today. And that vision is now absolutely tangible. China's being a strong, rich country is real. I mean, in the Mao period, it was very remote. And even in the Deng Xiaoping period, it was a project that was decades away. And now we're almost there. I mean, in many ways, we are there. There's a Chinese middle class, there's Chinese, kind of technology. There's a China that has never existed in modern history. Now, you, like me, have probably been hit with this question about Xi Jinping is the new Mao Zedong. Xi Jinping is the most powerful leader of China since Mao.
Yes.
And I'm always sort of a bit kind of dismissive of this, because the China of Mao Zedong, as you know, was not the China of Xi Jinping. I mean, it was not as powerful, it was not as wealthy, it was not as advanced. Being the leader of China today is not the same as being the leader of China in the 1950s and 60s, when it was a more marginal economy and much less developed. And so that means Xi Jinping's power is absolutely different, because it's over a different kind of thing. Very few countries have changed as radically as China over, the course of half a century. And so the Communist Party of China is, sort of the key strategic body to give life to this great vision of, a sort of strong, rich, powerful China. And for me, if you're a Chinese person, you might not think much about Marxism, Leninism. You might not think about ideology at all. You don't, but you do think about your country, and you do think about your patriotism. And the fact that this is such a real thing, that your country now has 37,000 kilometers of high-speed rail, and America has none, and Britain has about 100 kilometers. The fact that you're kind of maybe going to be the world's biggest economy in a few years' time, unimaginable. The fact that you're feared. I mean, it's better to be feared than to be laughed at. It's better to be feared maybe than to be liked in some ways. The fact that, you've got this leader who actually really, I tell you, we take this guy seriously, right? I mean, his worst critics do not dismiss him. That's kind of a manifestation of a China which is now really serious. And I think, this has to be recognized. I'm not, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing. All I know is for Xi Jinping and the Communist Party, this is, it makes sense to behave in quite an assertive and kind of pushy way, because they can. And, I think that this is not mysterious. Maybe just finally, I mean, the mysterious thing, I suppose, is that around Xi Jinping, obviously, there must be, there's lots of complexity. I mean, this is a complex country, many different complex groups, many, different socioeconomic groups and ethnic groups. And I feel troubled by the fact that the story about this country in the outside world is very simplified. It seems to me this cannot be a story about one man annexing all the power around him and just basically going me, me, me. I mean, I'm sure Xi Jinping has a healthy ego, right? But this is way too complex a story. And I just worry that we're just missing a kind of really important part of this, which is the focus on this nationalist mission is obviously very deep. But there's a lot of complexity in this China. And I think while people are focused on this vision, as it becomes more real and more manifest, there probably will be significant differences in society. And probably this era will be looked back as one of relative unity. I don't know whether China's future will be so unified, because there are so many differences. At the moment, it's all very focused on the nationalist mission because it's so real.
Yes, you've raised an awful lot of issues there. I was going to ask you about whether you thought Xi Jinping was a Maoist, and there is this kind of element of when Mao, when Xi talks about national rejuvenation or the new era and things like that, this echoes, Mao when he was in on the rostrum in Tiananmen Square in 1949. The Chinese people have stood up, and I think that this is. You say that he's kind of built the confidence of people and the pride of people in their country, so there's that kind of a continuity there, and I think that you're right in saying that that China has changed vastly. It's become far more powerful than it was in the Mao era. Xi Jinping has learned from the mistakes that the Communist Party has made under Mao and also under Deng, let's face it. So I can remember when Xi Jinping came to Manchester in, when would that have been, 2015 or 2016?
2015,
and I went along with a friend, and the central square was packed. All of the Chinese students, all of the restaurant workers poured out, and their various Chinese professionals and so on. And it was all Xi Dada, Xi Dada, and people were climbing up lampposts, to get a glimpse of him coming into the town hall. And it was fantastic experience, really. And I just wanted to kind of just take a little look at that. What was going on there at that time, because after all, it's only over the course of the 10 years now. Why was he so popular to begin with, and how did he sustain that, and how did he maintain the unit? Well, let's start with the popularity, and then
you mean popular in China or
question.
popular? When you say popular, you mean popular in China or popular internationally?
I thought I thought he was popular in China, the Xi Dada kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the problems in the 2000s was China had a story, but no one was telling it. And Hu Jintao, who we've seen in the news lately, in a very different guise, as the president then was quite silent. I mean, there was an often frustration that China was not domestically or externally really capturing people's imaginations. Now, if you remember, there was one politician who was kind of doing that at the time, at least towards the end of it, and that was Bo Xilai. And I often think about what would have happened to China if Bo Xilai had not been felled, and by the involvement of his wife in the murder of Neil Haywood, the British businessman, and also by his own unpopularity amongst the elite, and for corruption in the end. And that's what he was kind of accused of and imprisoned for. I mean, Bo was certainly a great communicator, and a lot of his policies in Chongqing were populist policies, the Sing Red campaign, the crackdown on illegal, mafia. They have a little bit of quite a big resemblance to what policies Xi Jinping followed. And in fact, Xi Jinping did go to Chongqing, I think in about 2010, 2011, and was very sort of complimentary about Bo Xilai's leadership. Of course, all that changed a year or so later. I mean, I think the fact that Xi Jinping has been able to tell the China story and has told it in a more approachable way, has obviously, kind of meant that he did something that was necessary. And his early speeches were quite direct and also often about his own experience, which, Hu Jintao never referred to at all. Hu Jintao was the man from nowhere. Xi Jinping is the man from everywhere. He's got a story for everyone. And that also repeats itself, in the outside world. When he goes to Russia, he refers to lots of Russian literature. When he goes to Germany, he refers to Goethe. When he comes to Britain, he refers to Shakespeare. And he even referred to the Game of Cards in America, the TV series. So he certainly, his speechwriters and he himself, kind of supports this quite clear communicative strategy. And I think that's why he's been at least initially, an accessible leader. Now, I mean, obviously things have changed since then. Internationally, I think two things have changed, one of which is in China and one of which is about the outside world. I mean, I think we remember the golden era in Britain and, 2015, the visit. And I think with the election of Donald Trump in 2016, 17, and a sort of big appearance of division in Western societies, I think China became a much more contentious issue. It became a bit of a political football. I'm not denying that there weren't, issues about trade with China, about politics with China. I mean, there've always been issues, but they had a particular sharpness because of the way that I think the, West in particular, and by that I mean North America and Europe in particular, were quite divided. And in Britain, obviously, the big debates about Brexit and, a kind of real sort of clash between different sorts of viewpoints and different sorts of groups. And I think China really became part of that. And, you got it becoming quite a politicized issue. And I think within China, probably a sort of creeping or growing sort of unease at the way that we governed ourselves, the sort of sense that I guess in the 80s and 90s, many Chinese officials and intellectuals and others, they kind of quite looked up to the Western models and thought, well, we're, doing things that they would quite like to copy. And I think that kind of went. It went particularly because of the dire condition of the Soviet Union, after it collapsed in 1991, and then Western reforms really caused problems in Russia. And then in 2008, the great economic crisis, the great financial crisis, I think China kind of looked at that and thought, wow, you guys are not even good capitalists. I mean, you kind of seem to always screw things up, and we can't do that. We can't take that risk. So I think these kind of things have really created an unfortunate personal, perfect storm, where we have a quite bewildered and perplexed and divided West. And we have a China which is not impressed by the division and chaos it sees. It's not impressed by an America which seems so divided. It must have looked at the storming of the Capitol in 2021 and thought, my God, who would ever sanction this? And I think these have just reinforced each other. How these end up, being manageable, I don't know. I mean, I think Xi Jinping's politics is as much about a response to the way the world has become, as it is about, a China kind of vision for that world. And that's often forgotten.
Yeah. So, I mean, we don't really want to get into a spiral of action and reaction. But I'd like to sort of talk about those things a little bit more when we go on to the 20th Party Congress. I mean, I think that, one of the things that you bring out in your book about Xi's popularity, you talk, it is great that the way, I mean, because some of these people, they can be so stilted, when they're speaking, and he's not like that. And, this direct way of talking that he developed. But the other thing that was really important, that really kind of, if you like, he had to rebuild people's trust in a communist party that was, that was getting quite corrupt, and that, the cadres were getting mixed messages about, you've got to develop business. So they went off and developed business, and that is a lot what happened, at the grassroots. And then, of course, Xi comes along and says, no, we've got to keep business and politics separate. And he keeps his family out of, business. And then, there are these purges of corruption. And so I think that those are kind of factors that kind of build up, his popularity. You talk about, China, grew hugely and, economically, and that, that Xi inherited that. So that meant that he could do much more, but he also kind of prepared the ground. And I was going to ask you, when you thought the turning point was where things started to go pear-shaped between the US and China, or the Western China, and that's something I really want to look into, because there are so many different elements of it. But I mean, some people would say, you know, that it was Xi's new era, you know, abandoning Deng Xiaoping's hide brightness, keep a low profile, you know, don't get into trouble. You know, that he kind of sails forth into the world, and with his message of shared humanity and so on. So, I mean, I think that, you know, you can pinpoint things on both, you know, both sides, that, you know, perhaps the West and Trump were, you know, reacting to that as well. So, the other thing that I wanted to ask, because I do want to just sort of, you know, focus in a little bit on this question about, you know, China's authoritarian nature, you know, how we can kind of lift up the covers on that and see what the other things that are going on underneath that. And yeah, you know, we know he's not a Maoist. You know, he's not afraid to shake things up, but, you know, Mao, just with the Cultural Revolution, I mean, Xi has a controlled, you know, campaign against corruption. And you talk a lot about stability and continuity. And so perhaps you can say a little bit more about is he a Confucian, even, if he's so, you know, so much emphasis on stability?
Yeah, I mean, those important issues. I mean, hybridity is not a problem in Chinese thinking. Roald Sturks of Cambridge, you probably have had him speak, you know, kind of the Needham, I think he's a Needham chair of Chinese sort of at Cambridge, wrote this very lovely book, you know, What Do Chinese Think? Or I think how do Chinese thinking, that's right, it's called Chinese thinking. And, you know, it's pretty clear that there is a sort of comfort with hybridity. You know, you can be a Confucianist, Taoist, and a sort of a kind of Buddhist, and in the 20th century, you're Marxist, Leninist, and in the 21st century, well, you can add a whole bunch of things. You can be a Xi Jinping thought person, a capitalist. The flexibility, I suppose, in Chinese thinking is impressive, and I guess that's what's unsettling to people of a Western mindset like myself. We're good Enlightenment people. We like tidiness, and you come along and you meet someone who kind of can embrace quite radically different things. You immediately want to kind of work out, well, is this consistent or not? We like coherence in our thinking, and I think that is probably a difference. I don't want to sort of paint with a too broad brush, but it is a difference. Now, I think you could say that Xi Jinping is a Maoist because he's a nationalist. I mean, you know, and Maoism was also quite a surprisingly, in its early iterations, pragmatic. It wasn't particularly interested in theory. You know, Maoism was often quite dismissive of theory, but it was certainly interested in how you do things and get kind of groups to support you. And famously, of course, Mao radically changed the understanding of Marxism to make an agrarian revolution in ways which I'm sure Marx would not have thought were possible. So that kind of interest in doing rather than, you know, kind of necessarily thinking is, I think, part of the Xi Jinping thought ethos. Now, in the Congress, which we'll probably talk about later, a figure that emerged again, a survivor in the last Congress, was Wang Huning, who is the great ideologue of contemporary China. And we look at Xi Jinping and we forget that behind him is an edifice which Wang Huning constructed. And his importance is often downplayed because he is a phenomenally sort of boring and kind of you know, abasing person. I mean, Wang Huning is the most underwhelming character, but I mean, his influence is colossal. I mean, he must be one of the most influential people in the world. And not just in Xi Jinping's era, he was influential from the mid-1990s. And his fingerprints are over the Jiang Zemin ideology of the three represents, the Hu Jintao scientific development, and the China dream. What is the essence of Wang Huning? Well, it's important today because Wang Huning, I think, is the great articulator of Chinese culture being a cool and great and amazing thing, not from the 20th century, but deep into history, and that contemporary Marxist-Leninist leaders of the Communist Party should not be ashamed of using references to traditional Chinese culture, because it is giving them cultural confidence, and it is reinforcing the sense that China has a unique path, a unique trajectory, and that is authentic and powerful and absolutely, kind of something that can be useful for politicians and is crucial for politicians. So I think the power in contemporary China is not in the economy. It's not necessarily in politics. It's in culture. And Hu Jintao, is really, really powerful at writing quite prophetic books in the early 1990s about the fatal sort of fractures in America, which were not its democratic system, but its cultural divisions. And that's why I think when China looks at what is happening in America over the last 5 to 10 years, that prophecy that Wang Huning wrote about in the early 1990s of America being fatally divided, to them is coming true. He wrote a book, Wang Huning, called America Against America, where he was very appreciative of, China, America. I mean, he went and stayed there for a few months in 1989. The book came out, I think, in late 89, rather strangely. But it was, it's a prophetic book because it did foresee that cultural divisions and cultural wars would be the biggest problem, and that China had to make sure that this didn't happen. If you transpose the cultural wars of the West to China, can you imagine, what enormous kind of craziness would happen? It would make the Taiping Rebellion look like an afternoon picnic party, I mean, so I think this is really...
Warring states.
Yeah, I mean, so there's a sort of deep structure. There's a sort of deep structure under this, which I think is not about Xi Jinping and about his kind of personality and his power. It's about these sorts of long-term trends where I think China definitely sees the West no longer as a source book of what to do, of good things to do. The West is seen now as a source book of failure. Now, I am not saying that's right. And I'm not saying that America and Europe can't get through this tough time, but I can see how Chinese leaders, that mindset, would look at what's happening and say, you guys are not going to teach us how we need to go forward. We have to rely on our own cultural resources, and they are the best in the world. So this cultural kind of confidence, I think, is crucial, but it's also alienating because it is so distinctively Chinese that it cannot be embraced by the outside world because we can't become Chinese. So all of this anxiety in the outside world about China coming and, trying to take us all over is misplaced. China is maybe a problem for many reasons, but not because it wants to run our affairs. In fact, China is probably a problem because it does not want to run our affairs. That's a different kind of challenge.
Well, again, Kerry, you've raised an awful lot of points there. And I think that really what we're talking about is how Xi Jinping constructed a new kind of legitimacy for the party. And that first of all, it was all about, Deng Xiaoping set it on a course of get rich, and the economy was growing and growing and growing, and there seemed to be opportunities, abundant opportunities. And then, of course, in any country, you get to a certain level of economic growth, and growth slows down. Also, as you say in your book, and you said earlier, China has become a much more complex society. There's a growing middle class. There are very rich, powerful businesses. And, it's how you hold all of this together. And I think that, that's what you're saying, this cultural vision does. And I mean, I don't think that, when we criticize authoritarianism in China, that we you know, we really need to think about the enormous challenges, you know, that China is facing. I mean, yes, you know, you say that the Chinese dream, you know, is almost there, but, you know, China is still in this transition. You know, it's been an export-led, labor-intensive, low-wage economy. You know, there's iron and steel and cement and all these horrible polluting industries. And, you know, to move from one model of economic growth to another model of economic growth, and to shift, you know, the very pillars, you know, from one to another, you know, the potential, you know, for social stability, for social instability, you know, it is huge. So in some respects, I see the kind of, you know, the tightening up in China, which is definitely happening, you know, under Xi Jinping, you know, is you know, tightening control over the party to keep China on course in what they see is a continuing path of development.
Yeah, I mean, one of the kind of curious things is we used to worry a lot about China's problems, and under Xi Jinping, the world seems to be more worried about its problems coming from China and what China's going to do to it. And it's forgotten all the things you just talked about. China's natural environment is probably the critical position. It's unseasonably warm in Britain at the moment. For those in Britain, China this year has had searing heats in Chongqing, I believe, over 40 degrees. Someone said, I think on Weibo or Twitter, that they had walked in Chongqing and the rubber on their trainers had literally melted on the tarmac. It was so hot. Floods, issues which I think Xi Jinping has talked about a lot. I mean, he's an environmentalist. And we have to remember also the enormous problems of inequality. China said that it had eradicated absolute poverty a year ago, but many people still are having a tough time, and probably with the economic woes that are already here with the housing market, with unemployment in China, this transition that you just referred to, Jenny, these are tough times. So in a way, the Chinese leadership are a perpetual kind of crisis cabinet. You know, they have to deal with this perpetual crisis of trying to create growth, but also sustainable growth. Now, on the environmental issue, if I can just say a little bit about that. I mean, on the report that Xi Jinping gave at the first part of the Congress on the 16th of October, the environmentalism was there. And he talked about environmentalism when he was party secretary of Zhejiang in the early 2000s. And I think it's a good thing that China is led by someone who takes the environment seriously, right? That is a really, really important thing. And we have to remember that it is likely in 100 or 200 years' time, if I'm sure we will make it through this critical moment, that if this period is going to be remembered for anything, it will not be remembered for, the Congress and stuff like this. It will be remembered for whether humanity manages to do the climate.
Sorry, Kerry, your microphone seems to have...
Is it okay now?
Yeah, it was just got terribly muddy.
Yeah, sorry. So I'd have to say in a couple of 100 years' time, if we survive, it is likely that we will remember this period not for, kind of the Congress or Liz Truss, we certainly won't remember, but we remember it for whether or not, did people solve climate change issues? Did they come up with solutions? And I think China is in a really strong position to contribute massively to that. Absolutely. Its commitments to research and development funding are huge. I mean, that's really meaningful, actually. The fact that it's trying to create an innovative culture, even if, we can argue about how it's doing it, well, it's trying. And the fact that, it is, until, kind of recently in political problems over Taiwan, it did have a pretty good dialogue with America on climate change. And I hope that will continue as soon as possible. I mean, these things are probably more significant than anything else. And the fact that China is positively engaged on those means this is a different situation than if China were not to be positively engaged with those. If it weren't to be positively engaged with climate change, combating that, this would be a disaster. It would be a disaster. So I think that's often forgotten, that huge issues In fact, China does not differ vastly from the approach of the West. Pandemics, kind of trying to stop them, no matter how it handles them after they break out. Yeah, it doesn't want those to happen, so it's going to be a big ally there. I don't think it wants nuclear proliferation, to be absolutely honest with you. I don't think it's particularly keen on that. I mean, the big sort of existential problems, I don't think China is an outlier, right? So I'm often sort of interested by how the high level big stuff, I think the dialogue kind of is okay. But obviously the more kind of, I wouldn't say parochial, but the more sort of localized stuff and the more kind of political with a small and a kind of a small piece stuff, yeah, there's a very big lack of alignment at the moment.
Absolutely. And I wanted to I just wanted to go back there, because you say, you're talking about Xi Jinping as being profoundly nationalistic. Of course, you can break that down a little bit, because part of the nationalism is this vision of China having common prosperity. It's not simply, make the nation great again. Yeah. And also, as you say in your book, China has a global vision, and rightly so, so most people would see, Chinese nationalism, as you described, that, China is now relentlessly in pursuit of its own interests. The rest of what it says is just empty rhetoric. All this stuff about a shared future and a shared vision for the future. So it's this interesting balance, isn't it, between sort of, strengthening China, but also seeing strengthening China in terms of, tackling, strengthening the world, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, this nationalism is an interesting thing, because politics everywhere seems to be quite nationalistic now. I mean, it is in Britain, it is in America, clearly, it is in parts of Europe, and definitely in Russia. And so nationalism is such a broad term. You have to kind of ask, well, what does it mean when you apply it to a particular country? Now, if I think for China, this nationalism has been around for a long, long time, right? I mean, at the fall of the Qing, Britain was anxious about Chinese nationalism, and in the 1920s, with the rise of the Kuomintang, there was this big sort of frightened worry by Britain because of its interest in China then about Chinese nationalism and, what to do about it. And we've always seemed to be uneasy with Chinese nationalism and wondered what the world would look like if China really did become a powerful, strong country. So we are now there. I think, this is a big change in our history. China's a strong country now. I mean, it's happened. And, what does that really mean? I think we're working this out. As I said, I don't think it means that China's going to be wanting to create a sort of alliance system like America, and then, seeing the exportation of what you'd call a China model. I don't believe that's what it's doing. But it's clearly a challenge, because China obviously has a very distinctive view of itself and a very distinctive view of its role in the world. It's not going to try and replace the United States, because it doesn't think it's the United States, it thinks it's China. So it's going to kind of create a more, or is creating a more hybrid sort of dual track world. I mean, can that work? I mean, it has to work. I don't think we've got any choice. I mean, we now know that despite a lot of work on both sides, in good faith, I mean, I'm not, kind of decrying the faith of America or China to work together. They, clearly disagree profoundly on some issues, and that has to just be managed. I think we just have to live in a world where these two powers just have to manage that. They can't live without each other because of climate change and other huge things that they're going to have to work with together for their own self-interest. But I think that they can also certainly find different spaces to work in. I'll give you an example. It's clear that for some companies like Huawei, there's no markets really in Europe, America, and Australia for them now, but they have markets in Latin America, Africa, Middle East, and in China. So this is a sort of dual track world in a commercial sense. If you look at the sanctions against Russia because of its invasion of Ukraine, yeah, Europe, North America, Japan, South Korea, and others, they sanctioned, but over 150 countries, I think, didn't sanction. And that's the sort of dual track world in action. Now, does that mean that this, dual track world is going to always be fighting the West? No. On Russia, China has abstained, as did another 18 countries at the UN resolution. It didn't support Russia. I think only 5 countries supported Russia. But it's not going to be a big ally of the West too. It wants a world of non-alignment. And that's a story we all know has been around for a long, long time. Now, this is not going to be a particularly relaxing world, I'm sure, we can already see that. But it's a world where we'll just have to manage. And we have to just fight for the status quo. Now, I think that is not, as an idealist, I suppose, yeah, I wish things were different. As a pragmatist, well, we can work with that. We can definitely work with that. I'm more excited by the idea of a huge global climate change, sort of concord than I am by, maybe some more nebulous political agreement that doesn't really mean anything. I think, we'll probably see, we have to remember under Xi Jinping, with this centralized leadership, deals can be done. Deals can definitely be done. If you want to do a deal on climate change, you just have to sell it to one guy. And at least that makes life a bit easier. So it's not the ideal outcome probably for some people, but to me, it's a workable one. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as you're talking, I'm thinking about, in the EU-China investment agreement that wasn't, that in the end fell through. I mean, of course, there was this, cooperation with third parties on climate change, which really meant working together, for example, to help Africa, adapt quickly in a green way to development. And, these opportunities are being missed and missed and missed and missed again. I mean, the other thing is that, anyway, let's go on to the 20th Party Congress, and I'm sure that these things that we're talking about will come up again. But I have to ask you in relation to that, what did you make of Hu Jintao being escorted off? Well, you don't have to answer if you don't want to.
No,
but...
I mean, I'm sort of non-conspiratorial. I mean, it was awful optics. I mean, obviously, it was a very poignant kind of, image of Hu Jintao being sort of, led off the stage. And so I can't imagine that this was staged, I mean, because it did look awful. I probably think it was because he's clearly not well. I mean, he wasn't looking great when he appeared at the 100th anniversary of the party, I think last year or some other major event. He has not been excised from, or kind of taken out of party messages, I mean, and records, which usually happens when people are out of favor. And so I prefer to think it was because he, was just not well and maybe doing things that were a little concerning. So people had to kind of escort him off. But what is clear is that the Congress was a highly controlled event, obviously, and the message that seems to have been taken by the world is, that Xi has now really bolstered the powers around him, and the 6 people that came out are on the Politburo. There were some surprises. Li Keqiang could have served another term. He's under the retirement age, but he's obviously gone. Li Qiang, who's the potential premier, that will happen next March if it does happen, is not really an economist. I mean, his career has been wholly political, apart from the party boss of Shanghai. And then the others are sort of really closely linked to Xi because I think Cai Qi worked with Xi Jinping in Fujian and then in Zhejiang for some years. And Li Xi, Ding Xuexiang, they're all very closely connected to Xi, from being his chief of staff in the case of Ding Xuexiang in Shanghai, to, I believe, Xi being the kind of private secretary of his father, Xi Jinping, in the 1980s. So it seems that there's this extremely close link with Xi Jinping. What does it mean? I suppose for me, the really interesting thing is that the fact is this leadership are going to be dealing with some pretty horrifying economic challenges. They're coming thick and fast.
Exactly.
And you know, so they've really got to have some answers. They've got to have some answers to the housing market, to the falling growth, to unemployment, to the international environment being pretty dim at the moment. Not a great deal of optimistic news. That's where they're going to have to really perform. And I mean, the COVID, you know, zero COVID obviously is, the commitment continues to have, you know, that policy, but it's been very unpopular. And so I'll really be watching that in the next year. I think if they can show that, you know, they're obviously capable administrators, they can deal with this challenge, then I think that they acquire legitimacy. If they struggle, well, we clearly have a problem. I mean, just finally on that, Jenny, I mean, them struggling is not a good thing. I mean, you know, for the world, like it or not, a failing China is a huge problem. I mean, that's the quandary. I mean, you know, politically, people have issues with China and are not happy with the Xi Jinping leadership and all the rest of it, but they will probably have way bigger problems from a failing China. You know, its integration into the global economy now is very deep. And I think we need to be very cautious when we have very adventurous politicians saying that we want to treat China as a threat and all the rest of it, and, you know, kind of get involved in the Taiwan issue. I mean, we have to be a bit prudent, because a China which is falling apart, or a China which overreaches, is a bigger problem than the China which is assertive and, you know, sometimes a bit of a pain.
Yeah, absolutely. Time has flown, Kerry, and we've run out. I mean, you know, I quite happily have carried on this conversation. It's really it's great to talk with you about these things and to hear your latest thoughts as well. And I believe that you're writing another book now about Western perceptions and stereotypes, and how we actually deal with the West rather than, you know, the Western mentalities, rather than how we deal with China. And yes, I mean, we need to have the spotlight shone on us as well. So just a few things to wrap up. Once again, Kerry's book, as you can see, it stimulated a really interesting conversation. I recommend it, and his publishers did the right thing in saying you must make it accessible, and you learn a lot about China and about you know, how to unpick some of these misperceptions that we have about this brick wall of you know, authoritarianism and so on, and how, you know, China has pulls together and remains united. So I think it remains for me now to say, oh yes, to say, if people here have come across SACU for the first time, please do think about joining SACU. It doesn't cost very much. We are planning to have, we do have member only discussions, or discussions for members, and we're drawing up a list looking at the approaches of SACU to Anglo-Chinese relations, and we'll also be talking about some of the themes that Kerry's been raising about democracy and governance in China, and talking about the Chinese community in Britain. And this is an evolving program, so I do invite you to join SACU and take part in these discussions if you want to be engaging in more of these kinds of debates. And okay, so thank you all very much for joining us, and thanks so much to Kerry, and I hope we see you again before too long. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Bye. Thank you very much, Jenny.
Bye.